Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Christine Leonard. I'm the director of the DC office for the Vera Institute of Justice. Thank you for coming to this session this afternoon. It's great to see so many familiar faces back for this briefing series that we've been holding since September. As many of you know, thanks to the support of the MacArthur Foundation, the Vera Institute of Justice has been convening a series of briefings around the state of juvenile justice, both about the research that has evolved in the field, as well as some of the important reforms that have been taking place on the state level. So we very much appreciate your time today. I'm very excited for the panel that you'll be hearing from soon. Just as an overview, I wanted to say that for any of you that may have missed some of our earlier sessions that started with a robust conversation about the developments around adolescent brain development research, as well as who are the kids that are getting caught up in the youth justice system, and particular focus on youth with special concerns around mental health and substance use disorders, as well as the role of lawyers and families and working with the system. That all of these briefings are now up and available on Vera's website, as well as the fact sheets that we've produced for each one. We've got one out there for you today, as well on today's topic about returning home, creating paths for success in communities. So we very much appreciate your time and your interest in these issues and your willingness to stay with us for this series and hopefully come back and join us. We'll have one more briefing on January 21st, kind of diving deeper on the subject of interagency collaboration. And that briefing here in the Senate will feature panelists from the state of Connecticut, Mike Lahr, who's the Undersecretary for Criminal Justice Policy and Planning there, as well as Jessica Heldman, who's with the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, and Ryan Ward, who had been with us for our conversations about family, to speak about tribal youth experiences and the intricacies of system involvement for those youth. So I'm really pleased to be here today with my colleagues from Vera, who I want to thank Sarah Schmitz from our DC office and Libby Love and our terrific interns who helped us put together this series, as well as my colleagues from Vera's New York office, Krista Larson, the director of our Youth Justice Program, who will be moderating today's panel, and her colleague Ryan Shanahan, who's the director of Vera's Research Program in the Center of Youth Justice. It's really been a team effort, and I'm grateful that we've all been able to come together around this important topic. So I won't say too much more, except that I was really thrilled that over the holidays, one of my favorite gifts was Brian Stevenson's new book, Just Mercy. And I know that many of you are familiar with Brian's incredible work with the Equal Justice Initiative and the representation that he's done for individuals all over the country, particularly those facing lengthy sentences of life without parole or the death penalty. And I was pretty excited that I was on a long flight and able to make it through the book, since I don't do a lot of reading outside of the official stuff anymore. But you know, one of the things he points out in his book is that as a country, he says, the true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And Brian really, among others, it really stands out in his perseverance in representing so many individuals who may have otherwise been left voiceless within the justice system. And in his book, he goes into great detail about some of the people that he has met, both in terms of individuals he has represented, but also stories of others that had contact with the justice system throughout their lifetimes. And so I wanted to flag one of the narratives that he points out in his book, because I think it's very timely for our conversation today. And he refers to an individual who describes himself as a former juvenile felon, been adjudicated as a juvenile delinquent when he was 17 for multiple convictions for arson, theft, aggravated assault, gun violence, and finally assaulting police officer. This individual later confessed, "I was a monster." His life didn't begin to change until he found himself in prison in a sea of puke and urine following another arrest. Pretty serious conduct, as well as potential for lifetime ramifications. Well, interestingly, the individual that Brian's referring to was not just another youth who got caught up in the system but actually former U.S. Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming. And that's the former senator's own characterizations of his activities and the subsequent consequences when he was an adolescent. Then he went on later in his career to serve 18 years here within these halls. And I think it's really noteworthy to point out because, whether it's luck, circumstance, or hard work, we were all teenagers. All kids make mistakes, and there should be consequences that come from those mistakes. But I think throughout this series, what we've really tried to highlight is that there should be some degree of proportionality for those consequences, certainly a system that is perceived as fair by youth, but also really significantly what happens after the youth's first point of contact with the justice system and what tools and services can be available to them in order to help them get back on a path for lifetime success in our communities. And so I think with that, I'll turn it over to Krista for today's panel, which is really focused on kids who have already been in the system and how can we help them navigate successfully from those experiences moving forward in their lives. So thank you again for joining us. The one last quick thing I'll mention is that I'm really excited that at our wrap-up event on February 6th, we're going to bring back one of the most renowned researchers in the area of adolescent brain development, Dr. Lawrence Steinberg from Temple University. He's recently published a book called The Age of Opportunity. So he, along with invited officials from the White House and the Justice Department and other senior practitioners in the field will be here for our final conclusion of this series. So we hope to see you then. But thanks again for your time and attention today, and we hope to have a robust dialogue with our distinguished panelists. Well, I'm just thrilled to hear. You're going to have a great panel. Ned and Greg have been patient and friends of mine for over 10 years, and I just hope that all of you get to swap business cards at the end so you can stay in touch with them as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Christine. So I'm Krista Larson. I'm the director of Vera's Center on Youth Justice. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I have a couple of framing comments, and then we'll just really turn it over to our panel this afternoon. We are taping today's event, but and then we'll have a little bit of a talk amongst the panel, I think, and then we're going to stop taping just so everyone can feel comfortable having sort of an open dialogue for the next portion. And then we're also hoping there'll be a little time at the end for you all to sort of come up and interact with the panelists individually if that's something you're interested in. So to introduce the panel, to my left is Gabriella Celeste, who's the Director of Child Policy at Case Western Reserve University's Shubert Center for Child Studies. She was instrumental in the development of a policy agenda for improvements in the juvenile justice system, which were adopted in Ohio, which are captured in a case study of this policy effort entitled A Bridge to Somewhere: How Research Made Its Way into Legislative Juvenile Justice Reform in Ohio. To her left, we have the Honorable George Timberlake, and Judge Timberlake has served as the chair of the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission since his appointment by Illinois Governor Pat Quinn in January of 2010, and he's a primary member of the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice. I should say each of these distinguished panelists has a much longer resume that we can offer to you, but we're going to keep it very brief just so we can get to the important content. Ned Loughran is the first and founding executive director of the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators and the president of the PBS Learning Institute, which in this instance is performance-based standards, not the PBS we may be more familiar with. And he was previously the commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services and worked in the New York Division for Youth prior to that. And last but not least, we have Gregg Croteau, who has served as the first executive director of UTEC in Lowell, Massachusetts since February 2000, and has what we've updated now as a 25-year career working with young people in a... That's right, it was 18 years this morning, it's been a long day. 25-year career working with young people in a variety of capacities over the life of his career. So just to kind of lead us in, one of the things that we've been talking about through this series is that A lot of the system reform in juvenile justice over the last several years has been about how do we keep young people out of the system? How do we move them? How do we invest in community-based alternatives that have been shown to be more cost-effective as well as just simply more effective in terms of youth outcomes instead of investing in costly custodial environments? And that's been a large part of the conversation over the last several years, and it'll be touched on today again. It also drives a couple of parallel questions. So if we're successful in moving low-level young people that make those kinds of adolescent mistakes that Christine referenced, young people that are known as status offenders who get in trouble for things that are only a matter of law enforcement because of their age and status as a minor, things like truancy. What do we do with the young people who we still have in the system, those we decide that we do need to put in an institutional setting in a place of confinement? How do we make sure that we're doing it right, making sure that we're meeting the principle of doing no harm? Unfortunately, that's a standard that we have not always met with our juvenile justice systems, and federal action has been really critical in setting national standards for safety through actions like PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, that has set standards in juvenile facilities around sexual abuse and harassment, as well as direct intervention, investigations, and further action by the Department of Justice in jurisdictions that are found to have real issues in terms of constitutional violations around their conditions of confinement. And those types of federal actions have really been instrumental in a number of jurisdictions in spurring state level or local level reform. And we'll hear a little bit about that today as well. And so once we push past this concept of basic safety and basic constitutional rights, we have an opportunity to think more expansively about how we invest in programs and practices in custodial settings that can help young people turn things around. We have had recent guidelines from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education around correctional education just last month. And so these are important steps that we can take, investments that we can be making in helping young people to set their lives on a very different path. And finally, the other question we should be asking is if we manage to transform our custodial system so that we have investments in working with these young people to help them improve their education and their mental health and to increase their belief that their lives can be something other than what maybe they thought before they became involved in the justice system. How do we make sure that they don't lose those gains because of ineffective transitions to the communities at the point of release? Because we really can lose a lot at that point of transition. Hope can be very fragile at the point of release, and young people can really become discouraged. And sometimes that's because of the system practices that we have in place. We have to make sure that we're not throwing up additional barriers for young people in terms of their juvenile records or the way that they can access services. And we have to have services in place that can help them and their families welcome them home and help those young people feel that they can actually achieve the goals that they're setting for themselves. So with that, we're going to kick it off today with Gregg and his description of the work that they're doing in Massachusetts.
Great. The red light mean we're on, or the red light mean we're off? We're on. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, and good afternoon. I want to thank the Vera Institute for putting this together, and it's great to be alongside such a great group of experts and panelists. So I'll share a little bit about the work that we do in UTEC and Lowell, and again, at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. I apologize in advance. Sickness is trying to enter into my body, but I'm denying it, so hopefully I don't have to take several breaks in between and it makes sense what I'm about to say. But I wanted to give a little bit, I can focus my words really around what I think would be three focus areas that we've seen over years that worked effectively for us around reentry. I'll provide a little bit of a background to UTEC and what we do as a youth organization. But I think to begin, I'd like to just give a brief overview of how I came to this work. So I've been doing this work for about 25 years now, and I'm from Revere, Massachusetts, which is right around East Boston area. UTEC is in Lowell, Massachusetts, and I began doing this work in Revere. There was a lot of challenges between the Southeast Asian community and the Italian community, and I really wanted to be a part of the bridge work, and that's kind of what sparked my interest. And once I started doing it, I knew this was exactly, it just felt right, and I wanted to continue doing it. And I wanted to pick up a language that I could use in my youth work. That took me to grad school. It took me to Vietnam. I spent a couple years there to pick up a language I could use in my youth work. And then I totally stumbled upon the opportunity for this group of young people back in 1999, 2000, who put out an ad. It was one of those ads you have like one line. They didn't have the resources to put 2 or 3 lines in the newspaper. And it was for a director because a group of young people with some adults in the community wanted to create their own safe haven. They wanted to create their own teen center in the midst of downtown Lowell. And downtown Lowell was considered the neutral area, free from any of the gang affiliations and the territories that come about when you go into the neighborhoods. And so you had young people that were ready to go and fired up to create their own safe haven in downtown Lowell. And so they were the interview committee. There was a group of about 20 folks interviewed me. They became the board members. They helped with the bylaws. They hired all the adult staff. I was hired as the first full-time staff. And so it was a privilege to be hired by them and to continue working with them. So we started with a grant of $40,000. Fast forward 15 years, now we're at $4 million. But our model has scaled up, incrementally. So when we first started, what we have today is, was a work in progress. And so at the heart of it was really to make sure that we could keep our young people safe. In Lowell, we have 25 to 30 active gang sets. And someone else was asking me before, some of the reasons why young people get involved in gangs. And for us, our target population are young people that are seriously gang involved and seriously criminal involved. So we're working with, as we define it, proven risk young people, not to distinguish it against at risk or even high risk. These young people have already risked. 40% of them have felony arrests, serious gang involvement. And in Lowell, I think, the gang involvement varies from community to community. I think you probably see some, overarching themes. If you ask the question of why a young person might join a gang, one young person might tell you because of protection, because they have to walk through a neighborhood and they have to be protected from the other rival gang set. Another young person might have it for that sense of belonging. For whatever reason, whether it be their family works third shift or their family isn't around for a certain reason, it provides that sense of belonging to them. Others grow right into it. We know young people that their fathers, their grandfathers are bloods. And so you grow right into it. It becomes just part of the family structure. There are benefits, and obviously there are serious disadvantages to the criminal activity that happens. But there are a variety of different reasons, and some of them are reasons that young people get into because they have to, for various circumstances. And so we respect that, and we have street workers who are dressed in bright orange uniforms, who go out into the community and who are charged with making sure they reach those young people. On one side of it, we do it on the street side, so we know who the 25, 30 shot callers are, the leaders of the gang sets, and we'll engage them. And on the other side of it, we work with young people behind the walls in the prisons. So we make sure we've covered that pipeline to capture, for lack of better words, to engage those young people when they're involved in serious gang activity. And so we were doing that for about 15 years. We've kind of formulated our outcomes, which are driven around 3 primary outcomes. Number 1, front and center, is recidivism. We know we have to keep our young people free from incarceration, free from court involvement, and then the outcomes of education and employment. But they have to be free from the court activity, and they have to be free from incarceration for them to move forward on that. But that's what we hold ourselves accountable to. That's what we hold our young people accountable to. And so we do serve a lot of young people who are coming from reentry circumstances. We straddle both because we serve young people in Lowell that go from basically 16 to 24. So we'll straddle both juvenile and adult correctional facilities. And so, in thinking about today, I was thinking about a young man who's been with UTEC for about a year. And this young man, we'll call him Larry, and he has a very strong presence. He was incarcerated for about 7 or 8 years, and I remember it was about 4 or 5 months ago, and UTEC gets engaged in a lot of policy making, a lot of advocacy, and we get our young people engaged in that. And so this fall, we actually had what we call a policy prevention, youth violence prevention policy series. And we had a group of young people engaged in it. We had all the gubernatorial candidates who were running for office in Massachusetts come through UTEC, not just for a tour, but to be engaged in what we saw as the high priority policy opportunities. And they went through the building, and we had a variety of kind of questions and answers. And then we went upstairs to the room, and we had a more, small, intimate focus group. And Larry was there with about 4 or 5 other young people and a couple of our staff, our street workers. And Larry can command the room. And with the candidate there, kind of just stopped the conversation, and he was like, "Today is my anniversary." And everyone was like, "You're not married. We know it's not your birthday." And what the anniversary was, no one expected. It was the anniversary of August 7th, was the 6-month anniversary that Larry had met the street workers when he was locked up in prison. And I think that, he had it down to the time, to 2:30 in the afternoon when the street workers first met him. And that was significant for Larry because a lot of other folks apparently had reached out, but it was those street workers who never knew Larry before this. He was coming back into our city. He lived in another city, but he was coming back into Lowell, and his name was given to us. Our street workers just approached him directly and made that connection. And that had some significant impact on him, and for us, it rose the issue of what we really see as one of the core practices for us is that during the pre-release stage. And you'll see a lot of the research will show this, but to be able to have that early engagement, that consistent engagement with a young person during the pre-release stage, and to be able to then set up the groundwork and the framework for the transition to be smooth is a huge gift for us to be able to do effective work with young people. And so, a lot of young people, whether it be in the juvenile setting or the adult, they'll have a variety of folks that'll come in contact with them in provision of services. But to be able to have one person that will stick with them no matter what, whether it be 6 months prior to release or a year prior to release, has been, I think, a huge asset for us to be able to build that relationship. And one of the things we've also found to be effective is also on the transition to be able to, we actually on the release day will pick up the young person because we know that that first 72 hours is critical to their engagement moving forward. And so we'll pick up the young person. We'll know that we'll have to handle the housing, the transportation, all the direct services right from the get-go. So moving forward in terms of the placement side of things, we then begin to think about what's the most effective placement for young people. And so knowing that we work with proven risk young people, we've thought a lot about the fact that we can't be just a second chance program. We can't be a fourth chance program. We have to be unlimited chances. And so we know that because, as many of you know, if a young person's involved in the system, sometimes, unfortunately, they're involved in these systems for 10 plus years. As youth workers, we can't expect that on the first day that we're going to meet them. Unfortunately, for those past 10 plus years, other adults have come along the way and have said they're going to be there for that young person, and they're not. And so we know that it's going to take time. We know that young people are going to push against us. We know that young people are going to push against that level of trust. And so we can't ever have that be a second chance and third chance program in what we do at UTEC. And so the model that works for us that's worked pretty well is this idea of social enterprises. So we'll actually create our own businesses. We call them social enterprises because they're really mission-driven. So we have 3 enterprises right now. They're food services. We have our own catering. We have our own cafe. We do furniture making. We do mattress recycling, where we take mattresses, we recycle all the pieces. And so young people come into our programs, and they'll get a job from the get-go. The beauty of the social enterprises, in addition to folks think that maybe it's the earned revenue stream that's the driver for us, but that's actually not the driver. The driver for us on the social enterprises is the fact that we can create our own rules and we can extend the clock working with young people. And that's a model that we found works really well with this proven risk population, because we know that if a young person is going to work with us, there has to be an environment that they're going to be able to fail safely and have a ramp to be able to go right back onto it. And that's what the social enterprise allows, because now we can create rules that are very different than if it was a 6-month training program and they went out into the community and had a job there and unfortunately blew out of that job and then they're back on the street. And so for us, we'll build that into the program. And that the last piece that I would mention that I think is pretty clear across all the research is that one consistent, caring adult sticking with them no matter what. And we'll hear that often. For us, it's that ongoing, we won't actually call our staff case managers, we call them transitional coaches. We know that our young people don't feel comfortable with the term case manager. And so that service will stick with the young person no matter what, whether they're in the program or out of the program, for at least 3 to 5 years. And I think, one of our street workers says it pretty well. Our street workers have experienced a variety of different challenges, whether it be gang involvement or addiction, and they've experienced it similar to the young people they're working with. And one of our street workers says that, we know how it feels when someone gives up on you. And what drives us is to make sure that we'll never give up on you. We don't want you to ever feel that way. And I think that's a big piece of the work that I think anyone who's doing this work knows, that at a certain period in time, we've all felt like someone's given up on us. And that can be incredibly difficult. But for young people to feel that everybody has given up on them, then that's when we need that person who's going to be there no matter what. And so I think, we feel like we have to be in the position to be able to engage that young person. So when you go back to the pre-release side of it and you're behind the walls, it's very intentional for us, because in the same way as we're there behind the walls, we're at the hospital when a young person gets shot. We're at the courtroom when a young person has to go to jail. Because these are the circumstances, that one moment when you know you can engage a young person when they might feel as though they're being given up on by everybody. And our street workers, part of their job description is to be at funeral homes. Because we know that's also that one moment when that window might be open for our young people. And so this idea of having the caring, consistent adult that stretches across the duration of their experience is a huge aspect of our model. But also we combine that with data, and making sure that we're tracking and holding ourselves accountable to the 3 outcomes. And so as we think about the cost-benefit work that we do, UTEC, we've been fortunate. We had funding from the Robert Johnson Foundation to do 18th month evaluation through Johns Hopkins of our street worker program. We've had other external evaluations. And in Massachusetts, which is similar, I think, across other states as well, the recidivism rate you'll see is about 65%. So 65% of young people, once they get arrested, within 3 years will recidivate, who get incarcerated. Our recidivism rate right now is about 15%. And so then when you look at the cost side of it, and in Massachusetts, you're looking at about $45,000 just for the housing bill to incarcerate somebody, and you add in the legal costs, the health care costs, the loss of tax revenue. Those go far significantly higher. For us, our cost for serve a young person annually is about $20,000, and that includes a 30-hour job. So I think for us, a big piece of it is to make the case that there is a cost benefit to this work that's saving the state, but really, if we can work with this group of young people, this group of proven risk young people, we feel like the other piece of it is the return on investment from a public safety, public health, and economic perspective is huge. So in conclusion, I would say that, Christine had mentioned it before about this idea of luck. And we've talked about this before as well, that I think a big piece of our work that we see at UTEC is to how to remove luck from the equation, so that it's not circumstance, it's not luck that guides a young person's success and moving from incarceration back into the community. And it's not luck in terms of how much social capital they might have. And I've shared this before, so I never had really thought about the reasons for how I get into the work, but I'm adopted. And when I was young, my parents divorced, and then my father died, but it was never, ever an option for my mother to let me stray off to one side. I lucked out in that was my mother who was there. And so I think a big piece of what we think about, and a big piece of what drives our youth workers, is to make sure that there is some type of systematized way to make sure that those young people don't have that social capital, for whatever circumstance didn't have that they can get pulled back into it. And as we think about policies, whether it be social impact bonds or pay for success contracts that can really show the true cost benefit of it, we hope that at the end of the day, we'll be able to think about policies that will create that. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. So we'll now turn to Gabriella, who will give us a perspective from Ohio.
Thank you. I had no idea what to expect when I first encountered Jesse, a 16-year-old kid locked up at the Tallulah Juvenile Prison in Louisiana. A prison, quote, so rife with brutality, cronyism, and neglect, according to one national news story, that many legal experts called it the worst in the nation. I had recently moved to New Orleans to co-found something called the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, and we were visiting Tallulah to meet with children about their treatment when Jesse was brought to us. A short, wiry kid with stringy blonde hair, Jesse sort of scuffled toward us very, very reluctantly. He had his hands and ankles so tightly shackled that I noted in my notes the cuts we could see in his skin. And despite the fact that we were attorneys there to help him, he kept saying, I'm short, don't mess with me, I'm short. And at first I thought he was referring to him because he was kind of a short guy. But what I realized is what he was referring to is the fact that he was supposed to be released soon. And he was very concerned that anything he might say or share with us could somehow jeopardize that opportunity. And we had learned that he had been in isolation for over a month when he was brought out to meet with us. So he had not been outside his cell for recreation, for education. He hadn't had a meal with other kids. And he, basically, when he sat down with us, he was incredibly jumpy, very anxious, barely could sit in his seat, kid. We eventually developed a trusting relationship with Jesse, but I'll never forget how frightened and confused he was when we first met with him. And while he was removed from isolation soon after we began meeting with him, the scars from his experience continued to haunt him after he left Tallulah. And one of the many lessons that I took from Jesse's experience, and quite frankly, many of the kids I met with, was that how we treat children in these institutions directly impacts how they're going to do when they return home. His experience of abuse, and perhaps even more than that, the trauma of just being so completely neglected and isolated in this solitary confinement, let alone the lack of effective treatment or education that he received, really stacked the deck fully against his chance for success. Lawsuits were eventually filed in Louisiana. We actually even closed the Tallulah prison, which is unusual, but the damage was already done for kids like Jesse. It would be convenient to conclude that this is a problem exclusive to Tallulah or to Louisiana or to the Deep South, but it's not, and I think we all know that. In fact, when I moved up to Ohio about 10 years ago, right at that time, our juvenile justice system there was being sued for unconstitutional conditions of confinement. And although it would take several years for Ohio to eventually settle that lawsuit, the litigation created really important pressure that helped us then move other kinds of reforms, both state legislative reforms and administrative reforms. But one of the most remarkable things I think about that litigation, and I had been involved in a lot of lawsuits, is that it had a settlement agreement with a set of guiding principles. You get very little sort of narrowly drawn relief, usually in the legal context. But these guiding principles were expansive in their thinking about how do we treat young people in the system. Now remember, this is a lawsuit about conditions in the facility, but they were really demonstrated a clear commitment by Ohio to move its system away from this kind of correctional model to more of a continuum of care, a regionalized service delivery system with small community-based facilities and evidence-based care at the community level. Now, on reentry in particular, I want to just highlight 3 statements that were part of these principles. First was a commitment to plan for reentry at the moment a youth enters the system. Please keep that in mind. That's really important. The second is that the state agreed to establish, and this is language I'm quoting from the agreement, a plan to keep juvenile offenders in the community when possible, substantially reduce the current reliance on institutional confinement, and where appropriate, return those juveniles who must be institutionalized to the community through a series of graduated programs responsive to individual needs. The third thing I'd like to highlight in the guiding principles was they actually enumerated strong reentry programs as a specific guiding principle in itself, noting that those efforts have to begin at the time of admission, use wraparound case management services, and include housing options for kids when they're released. Many kids don't have families to return to or places to return to, and inevitably end up back on the streets. I think, but even moreover, the settlement agreement, you see that Ohio commits to a system of care that was really informed by principles of adolescent development. It included language around engaging families and other significant adults in a young person's life, and ensuring that the workforce that they used was, quote, youth-focused and strength-based. So, in other words, it really appeared that the state was wholeheartedly embracing its responsibility for the young people in its care, and really beginning to take ownership, of what it means when we say we want to prepare a youth to lead a productive life. What does that require? But of course, an agreement alone is limited without ongoing accountability. And without going into much more detail here, I'll just simply say there was a lot of monitoring. There's been a lot of state-local partnership building, working with juvenile courts, working with private providers, working with university partners, a whole host of state legislative reforms, as well as some ongoing legal activities that has helped Ohio to make very significant strides in how we treat our young people. In fact, just yesterday, our office, the Shubert Center, released this report. They're out on the table. The Shubert Center really, our work is to bridge research and education with policy and practice for the well-being of children and young people. And so in this report, Getting It Right, Realigning Juvenile Corrections in Ohio to Reinvest in What Works, we chronicled some of the major milestones and strategies used by our Department of Youth Services to really shift its approach in juvenile justice. And I'll just say a big, capturing savings from closures of state correctional facilities and shifting those to more research-supported community interventions is a really critical piece to institutional change. You can't just close something and do nothing, or you can't say you want to have something that works and not reinvest those dollars into those programs. So while much work remains, a clear course, I think, has been set in Ohio. Now, effective reentry is a challenge that public systems continue to wrestle with. And juvenile reentry is unique for a variety of reasons, but in part because kids are juggling a few different transition issues. One is this transition from this facility to their home community. It's a physical transition, but another is a developmental transition, because many kids enter these facilities as kids or teenagers and leave as emerging young adults. And so you move from a place of dependence and really relying on family or systems to having to rely more on yourself and that independence. And yet you still need the guidance, as Gregg mentioned, and the support of a caring adult, as we all know in adulthood. Those are formed through community connections. It's the only way that'll happen. Another big piece of reentry for juveniles is that there's substantial collateral consequences to involvement in the criminal justice system that can follow and hinder a young person's progress for years. Juvenile records, even though they're not legally criminal convictions, can show up in background checks. They can hinder a young person's chance for employment, for housing, pursuing higher education, or other kinds of activities. So access to legal advocates who get the system, who can assist youth returning home to navigate sealing and expungement laws, sex offender registration laws, all kinds of things is another key aspect of effective reentry. Now, part of Ohio's philosophy is to reduce the need for reentry overall by making specific investments in this idea of evidence-based diversion efforts at the front end. By serving young people in communities, strengthening those connections while limiting out-of-home placements, we see better outcomes. So, for instance, a 2013 report by the University of Cincinnati comparing recidivism rates, or these reoffending rates, for Ohio youth served in the community versus those placed in state correctional facilities, or even the smaller community correctional facilities, found recidivism rates for low-risk youth were to be 2 to 4 times lower for those served in the community versus similar youth that are placed in a facility. Even moderate-risk youth who remain in the community reoffend at significantly lower rates than those placed in a facility. Now, given the huge cost differences in Ohio, it costs $561 a day. You do the math to put a kid in a state facility. We have to be more prudent with our public resources. A 2014 evaluation found that our state saves between $13.60 and $40.40 for every $1 spent on what we call reclaim programming. It's our acronym for community-based programming, instead of placement in a community correctional facility or state facility. So to the extent possible, it just makes practical and fiscal sense to avoid placing young people in institutional settings, both in terms of their positive individual outcomes, as well as immediate and long-term potential costs to victims. So my remarks so far are focused on juvenile facilities, and the negative impacts, though, are even more significant for children put in adult facilities, as are the challenges that face them on their release. Research shows that youth in adult facilities are at far greater risk of physical and sexual assault, more likely to commit suicide, and are frequently subject to solitary confinement. Let me just share a couple of statistics. A 2010 OJJDP report cites research finding that in adult prisons, youth are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted and 2 times more likely to be physically attacked by other inmates or injured by staff. Data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics show that in 2005 and 2006, youth under the age of 18 were 21% and 13% respectively of all victims of inmate sexual violence, even though they only made up 1% of the jail population. Studies have shown that youth in adult prisons are 8 times more likely to commit suicide than youth placed in juvenile facilities. And the numbers for youth held in adult jails compared to juvenile detention facilities are even more striking. And if a child is not placed in a juvenile-specific unit within a jail, they can be put in isolation, often, ostensibly for their own protection, but they're held in isolation for extended periods of time. We know that holding people in isolation, whether an adult or a child, has been shown to cause anxiety, paranoia, exacerbate existing mental health conditions. It simply isn't good practice. And finally, because adult jails and prisons are designed for adults, many of them are simply not equipped to deal with the developmental needs of children and youth. They're less likely to have age-appropriate mental health services or education services. And the lack of effective rehabilitative opportunities within the adult facility make a young person then, especially vulnerable to failure when they go home. On that note, on average, youth who are prosecuted as adults are 34% more likely to commit additional felonies than youth who commit similar offenses but remain in the juvenile system. 34%. So reducing the number of youth eligible for prosecution in adult court and placement in adult jails, or simply increasing opportunities for judges to do an individualized review of a youth in their cases, is a policy change that could limit this automatic application of adulthood on children as a matter of legal fiction. And in doing so, lead to better outcomes for youth in reentry. So I want to quickly just conclude by circling back to Louisiana. I want to share one of the bright spots that grew out of our work there. Realizing these huge hurdles that we're facing our young clients in leaving juvenile prisons, we spun off an advocacy project. It was called the Youth Empowerment Project. YEP still exists today. At the time, it was focusing exclusively on supporting youth in their healthy transition home. Their community reintegration program was the first in the state to provide community, educational, and employment reentry support to help returning youth build healthy lives, steer clear of the justice system, and just remain safe. Although YEP has since expanded its programming, its focus on building strong, caring relationships with youth advocates, similar to those street workers you talk about, is really central to its programs. And it's now the largest, most comprehensive youth-serving organization in New Orleans, managing an annual budget of over $3 million, serving about 1,000 youth. YEP's director, Melissa Sawyer, describes their core practice philosophy this way: being committed to, quote, the inherent value of kids having adults in their lives who are from the communities that they are from, providing them with nurturance, support, and opportunities. Sound advice, I'd say. So as we deliberate reentry issues for young people, I urge our policymakers to consider Ohio's guiding principles and the tactical sort of realignment of correctional dollars into effective diversion, as well as YEP's enduring example and others that you've heard about today of creating strong pathways for success. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Gabriella. And so we'll move on to Judge Timberlake.
Thank you for being here. I mean that sincerely. It's Friday afternoon. There's a sunny day outside, and You know, you folks are closer to college classes than I am, but I remember those Friday afternoons when it was sort of difficult to listen to people like us. So thank you for being here. The Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission is the state advisory group for Illinois, and that is the body in every state in the union necessary to receive juvenile justice and delinquency prevention funds from OJJDP. So we're a relatively large state, so we have an amount of money that is much more than the de minimis, which is $400,000 per state. So with that money, what can you do to advance the cause of juvenile justice? Outside the requirement that we look at status offenders in the justice system, keeping them out of detention, jail removal, keeping kids who are arrested out of county jails, and if they're there, the sight and sound compliance monitoring to make sure that if they're in a jail, they're not within sight or sound contact of adults, and finally, disproportionate minority contact. We do those things, but when I and most of the other members of the commission were appointed 5 years ago, we had a larger vision. First of all, we decided what principles we wanted to follow, and those are public safety. We're talking about kids who have committed crimes. That's why all of this structure is in place. So public safety, we need to and will improve. We do that through positive outcomes for kids in the juvenile justice system. You know, punishment doesn't create better behavior. Positive outcomes through programming and the kinds of activities, the kinds of programs that you've heard both from Gregg and from Gabriella do create positive outcomes. That creates positive safety because it changes the behavior of juveniles. And finally, fiscal responsibility. So those three things guide what we've done at the Juvenile Justice Commission. So to do so, we've taken two tacks. One is that we fund not just good ideas. We don't fund programs that have been around for 30 years and don't have any results. Instead, we fund innovative approaches. We fund research in the state of Illinois and at the same time look at research around the country. And then we fund demonstration projects to influence what will become public policy if it's successful. Besides that funding structure, we've also decided to provide reports. You know, it's our obligation to advise the governor, the legislature, and in our case, the Department of Human Services, which is the agency in which we are housed. We have to advise them on matters of public policy and how the system works. So to that end, we have created a number of reports in that last 5-year period. One of those was around raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction. Illinois was one of those states, one of the 12 at the time, who had an age of juvenile jurisdiction less than 18. So we created a report saying what were the ramifications of that, what was the effect of that on public safety, fiscal responsibility, and positive outcomes. And we're successful then, 1 year later, with the help of many of our advocacy groups, including MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change, including the Casey Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternative initiatives. With that and other support, we were able to raise the age of juvenile court jurisdiction to include 17-year-olds, based upon not only the effects upon the cost to the state, but also the science that there's no difference in characteristics or behavior between a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old. We created the first ever comprehensive study of disproportionate minority contact in Illinois. 41 out of the 102 counties in Illinois have at least 2% minority population. So we went to every one of those counties. If they didn't have data, we went there and counted it by hand. We went into the courtrooms, into the probation offices, and found out what we already knew, but proved that kids in our justice system in Illinois are black and brown. No surprise, but we couldn't say that with authority anywhere else. Based upon that, we published the guidelines for racial and ethnicity reporting. So we actually have a replicable system on a yearly basis to find out who's in our system based upon race and ethnicity. And finally, we have two reports I want to mention to you today. The first of those was called the Youth Reentry Improvement Report. It's outside. This is the one. We studied not only what the state of the field was around the country, but we also studied our own. That is, we sent commissioners to sit in on almost 400 parole hearings. We sent commissioners out to review probation and parole files of another 236, something like that. Literally went into the institutions and read through the files, paper files, this thick, of kids who were presented for parole consideration. What we found was that we had a system that was deeply flawed. First of all, a lack of due process. Lawyers did not appear in parole hearings. Lawyers did not appear in parole revocation hearings. Parole revocation hearings mean you're out and now we're bringing you back in. It's a further deprivation of liberty. Lawyers have a right to be there. Kids have a right to be represented. However, they were actively dissuaded for pursuing representation by saying, you have a right to a preliminary hearing in 10 days, just like you do in real court. But by the way, if you exercise that right, then it's going to take you about 30 days longer or 60 days longer for you to ever actually get the hearing. And that was, in fact, the truth. That's resulted in a class action lawsuit, a federal lawsuit, so that now that parole review process is under court order to provide attorneys in those hearings. That's a heck of a way to get to your basic constitutional rights, but that's what it took. We also found that, quite simply, the system did very little to prepare kids for life back in their communities. And in fact, the parole revocation procedure worked primarily based upon technical violations of a parole order. It was an adult system, saying we're going to provide adult. I could look at the orders. I did. Here's an adult order. Here's a juvenile order. They're the same. Asking kids to do the same kinds of things with the same kind of requirements that adults did. So it's no wonder then that 40% of the kids in our prison population on a daily basis were there for technical violations, didn't go to school, missed an appointment for counseling, that sort of a thing. 2% were there on the revocation caseload for actually committing another crime. That's a broken system. What we did is assist in advocating for and implementing a case management system, an aftercare specialist instead of a parole agent, with those same kinds of characteristics that Gabriella just described to you that was necessary. Meet your aftercare worker within 2 weeks after you are first admitted to a juvenile prison. Actively be assessed within that same 2-week period, not only for needs and strengths in your individual case, but also for your risk to the public of creating further crimes. And to use that information for case planning not only inside the institution, but also for your aftercare planning for when you're released. That also meant that those aftercare workers had to go not just to meet the kid in the facility, but to go to meet the family of that kid in that same period of time. Now that has rolled out. I'll tell you, though, that the failure of the parole system is not only the structure of it itself, but also how it was looked at by those field workers, by the parole agents before this change. And it was more a supervision and surveillance method instead of a support, help you change your behavior method, as Gregg has described, works so well at UTEC. So we've changed that entire structure in our Department of Juvenile Justice. We train the Prisoner Review Board members in juvenile development, as well as the kinds of problems those kids face from trauma, mental health, substance abuse, family dysfunction, lack of social integration. That's what we've done. By terms of that report and by our advocacy based upon that report, we also put our money up for $1.5 million to study two different populations. One in the city of Chicago, where the aftercare specialists were first rolled out, and secondly in East St. Louis, Illinois. Same kinds of tough conditions in both situations: extraordinary poverty, extraordinary crime, extraordinary substance abuse. But we wanted to see whether that aftercare system was going to make a difference in the lives of kids, or whether the parole system, or whether it was different than the parole system. Next Wednesday, we're meeting for the final time with those two different project the personnel, and we'll provide within a couple of months the results of that study. One thing I have to tell you is, surprisingly, it was more effective in East St. Louis with parole agents than it was in Chicago with the new aftercare specialists. Two reasons, I think. One is that it was a culture shift in Chicago, never been done before. In East St. Louis, a smaller jurisdiction in far southern Illinois, but with an extraordinary group of providers, those who are providing services, whether it was parole or an aftercare specialist, those aftercare service providers had real relationships with the parole agents that existed in their location. So it's relationship. It's not just that we have the science and the treatment modalities to improve lives. It also means the people on the ground have to know each other, talk to each other, and share information. The last report that I would talk to you about is the juvenile sex offender report, and you have a fact sheet in regard to that. We released that just in March of 2014. It had never been done before in Illinois, and it's an outgrowth of our belief that if we don't talk about the problems we're most fearful of, then we're going to legislate based upon fear instead of facts. So we went to look for the facts. What we discovered is that in 2004, there were 434 arrests for juvenile sex offenses in Illinois. 434, state of 13 million people. We found in 2010 that there were only 232 arrests for juvenile sex offenses in Illinois. So not only is crime going down, sexual crime is going down. More than that, we found that in most cases, in an extraordinary percentage of the cases, the victims of these offenses were family members, neighbors, or peers. So it's not stranger on stranger sexual victimization. Rather, it is in the context of a family that may have been sexualized by parents or others, but in most cases, there's no predation involved here, and that an extraordinarily tiny number of kids ever went on to commit an adult sex offense. Furthermore, we discovered that the actual treatment modalities available today produce not just a small recidivism rate, but a tiny recidivism rate. That being that in the 2011 meta-analysis of juvenile sex offending and its recurrence, it was found that it ranges between 7 and 15%. With treatment in our friends in Ohio, again, in Lucas County, with an active involvement in community-based sex offender treatment, that recidivism rate drops to 2%. So a tiny problem with tiny risk of further consequences, except to the person who's arrested for it. And we have instead legislated enormous consequences for those kids, namely the Juvenile Sex Offender Registry. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court 3 weeks ago, decided that based upon the U.S. Supreme Court's rulings that developmental considerations for children have to be taken into effect, and that kids are not adults, found that the registration of juvenile sex offenders was unconstitutional. That's a connection to this reentry question simply because of this. Juvenile sex offenders, even though a tiny population with tiny risk to the public, spend longer in juvenile prison than any other group. That means that we wait in prison for longer for these kids simply because they can't go home, perhaps because their victim's there. They can't go to school because their school won't take them. They can't go to the park to play in Illinois. And those kinds of consequences may be collateral, but it's an effect of a lack of understanding about what juvenile sex offending really is. so that adult consequences are given to them, and it means it intersects their development. So why do we care about this subject at all? I mean, why are we here? The Vera brief that was mentioned earlier tells us that 52,000 kids a year are reentering their home populations, in the general population, per year from prison. 52,000 kids. That's 1 year. So on an annual basis, we're creating 52,000 kids who have been in prison. They all go home, either at release or shortly thereafter. Kids go home. They always do, partially because they're kids, right? They don't have an independent way of living in the life. We know that incarceration is toxic. Ed Mulvey's Pathways to Desistance and Linda Teplin's longitudinal study of the detention population in Chicago tell us exactly that kids who go to jail come back at an alarming rate. Kids who go deeper into the system at every stage are at greater risk of committing further crimes. We have treatment. We have responses to almost every single behavioral problem for a kid. Some of it is simply mental health. Some of it's substance abuse. Some of it is trauma in their lives. Some of it is substance abuse that has started and may have intercepted that kid's life. We can provide that treatment at home, in home communities. Community-based alternatives are not only extraordinarily cheaper, they're also extraordinarily more effective than sending a kid to prison.
Right, and I think on that hopeful note, we will transition, and anyone who has additional questions will have the opportunity to ask them right after Ned shares with us his perspective. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. When I was commissioner of the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts a little more than 20 years ago, a sea change was going on in juvenile justice. It was what we call now the Get Tough movement, where virtually every single state in the union was passing a law to move more kids into the adult system or to be able to keep kids along in the juvenile system. And as the director of an agency, I felt very isolated. And I realized that I had very little input into the decisions that were getting made at the state level and at the federal level. And I didn't really have the connections with the directors, the other directors around the country, and there's only one per state, to share what some of the best practices were. And so a small group of us got together and decided to form an organization that would change that. And we formed the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators. And I'm pleased to say that we just celebrated our 20th anniversary this year, 1994. And we had very simple goals. One was to improve juvenile correctional services programs and practices, and the other was to provide national leadership and leadership development for the individuals responsible for the systems. And one of the first things we did, and it's kind of our signature program, is we, with the help of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, we developed a new directors seminar. And believe it or not, there are a lot of new directors every year. The average turnover rate, I asked the question this morning, and I think Christine got the answer. I asked the question this morning if people knew what the tenure for a youth corrections administrator in the state is. It's, you're on. Microphone. It's 2 years. And I'm pleased to say that mine was 8 years, and I held the record in Massachusetts. But there is a high turnover of the youth corrections administrators, and so it's so important to have an organization like ours that connects the directors right away and helps them to hit the ground running to lead the agencies they've been chosen to lead. So that's kind of some of our work on the national level. On the state level, right now we're partnering with the American Institutes for Research, a research firm based right here in DC, and with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University. We've just been awarded a grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, from here out, I'm going to say OJJDP, to run the Center for Coordinated Assistance to the states. And this center will provide technical assistance to the directors and their staff at the state and county level. A couple of trends that I think are going on right now that others have alluded to is, first of all, youth corrections has really right-sized itself. The low-level, nonviolent offenders are being diverted from youth corrections altogether or being placed in alternative community-based programs. Now, the youths remaining in the deep end of the system, they're older, they've been committed on violent offenses against the person, many of them are gang-affiliated, and many have serious emotional and mental health issues, and that's a group of kids that's our mandate, to work with those kids. But as everyone is basically saying, most of those kids, unless they're in the adult system, those kids are going back, and they're going back sooner than later. And sometimes it's better that they go back sooner than later, that they don't become institutionalized. Systems are moving away from the use of isolation as a behavior management technique. Unfortunately, some staffs don't know how to deal. They haven't been trained to deal with kids, or they've been there too long, and their management approach is, if the kid does something wrong, you lock the kid down. That is so contraindicated for anybody, especially for a juvenile, if you're trying to change their behavior and then you're separating them from the rest of the population. And then agencies are developing more comprehensive reentry programs or aftercare, and that's the purpose of our gathering this afternoon. In 1995, the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators developed what's called the Performance-Based Standards. It's a program of continuous improvement system launched by OJJDP specifically to address safety, health, and quality of life issues in youth correctional facilities identified as problematic in the 1994 congressionally mandated Conditions of Confinement study. And so we developed, up to that point, most of the standards that facilities were going by were what was called process standards. You shall have a policy that governs this, and you shall have a policy that governs that. But there was no measurement. No one measured what was going on inside of the facilities. They were hidden away. And so PBS's primary purpose is to provide facility and agency leaders and staff with national standards to guide operations, implement best practices that best serve youths, staff, and families, and to continuously monitor daily activities and culture within facilities using performance outcome measures. So over the last 20 years, PBS uniquely has established uniform data definitions, outcome measures, and a quality assurance process that creates the most timely, comprehensive, and accurate national database of its kind. The domains addressed by performance-based standards are safety, order, security, health and mental health, reintegration, and family and social supports, and justice. Each area has an overarching goal, a number of standards, and then a number of outcomes to measure the achievement of each standard. The reintegration standards are closely linked with a set of family and social support standards that were developed in partnership with the Vera Institute to guide a youth's reentry back into the community. A successful reintegration often starts with a successful reentry program. In the PBS, reintegration standards measure the effectiveness of a facility's reentry program. So the goal of reintegration is to prepare a youth and their family and social supports for each youth's successful reintegration into the community. The reintegration standards actually are being revised right now, but these are the general areas of the standards. That a case plan needs to be developed within 15 days of the youth coming into the facility. All the time I go out to these conferences, I hear lip services paid to reintegration. It ought to begin on the first day. Unfortunately, many times it begins a few days before the kid. That's not too true anymore, but it used to, a few days before the youth was leaving the facility. The facility staff must develop linkages with community staff and the aftercare staff. The case manager visits and develops positive in-person relationships with the youth while they are in the facility, and youths have appropriate services and supports when they're released to the community. Now, there are outcome measures that make sure that those standards are being fulfilled. And the outcomes measures cover the important components of a solid reentry plan, such as the number of signed treatment plans. You count the number of signed treatment plans. The continued or new treatment in the community for medical, mental health, or substance abuse issues. Many of these youths are being treated in the facility, but then when they go back into the community, unless the connections are made to the proper vendor or provider, then that treatment, whether it's mental health or it's a medical problem, does not continue. Youths being assigned an aftercare case manager within 15 days of their entry into the facility. In Massachusetts, we made sure it was done within the first 48 hours. A youth's in-person contact with his or her after case manager is measured. The average frequency of treatment meetings and case reviews, home assessments to determine the suitability of the next living arrangement for the youth, contacts between the family and the aftercare case manager, and visits to the youth home. These are measured. Referral and ultimately admission of youth to community-based programs or services before the youth leaves the facility. The youth's knowledge and contact with the community program or service they are going to be released to. And then counting the number of authorized leaves, passes, or furloughs that the youths have before they go home, which is very important as a part of reintegration. I'd like to just end by talking very briefly about the Massachusetts system, which is a system that as far back as before I was commissioner, so we're going back a number of years, when Massachusetts closed all of its institutions back in the late 60s and the early 70s, the first thing they did was to develop a wide array of community programs because only a small percentage of the population was going to be locked up in the future. And so therefore, Massachusetts got a leg up on a lot of other jurisdictions in developing the continuum of services. And so DYS, today, it takes the positive youth development approach very, very seriously, measuring improvements in education, social connectedness, and well-being. It serves youths in the most appropriate setting to meet their individual needs, so that does not have to be a secure facility. Family engagement is critically important to a youth's success in reintegration. And as I mentioned before, the reintegration standards and the family and social support standards, they are inextricably linked because they're so important, complementing each other. DYS strives to keep a youth as close to home as possible and to support the family involvement and to facilitate successful community reentry. Its community supervision strategy supports community tenure and is tailored to meet the unique needs of the individual youth. Revocation is a significant step to take because if a kid is not doing well, then it's important maybe to remove the kid from the community for a brief period of time. And that requires a structure that considers risk and provides the youth due process. DYS's practice is fair and transparent so that youths and families can invest in a process that results in constructive and lasting positive change. DYS is a data-driven agency that is committed to effective practice, positive youth outcomes, and measured progress. DYS does participate in the performance-based standards. And the way that DYS in Massachusetts implements all that came before is that it's established a community services network made up of the DYS case managers, the community organizations, private service providers, and the youth's families. They create the service continuum that recognizes and complements the work completed in the residential phase for youths. The DYS caseworker is the primary point of contact for all youth and their families from the time of commitment through discharge from the department. I like to call the caseworker is the linchpin that holds the entire case together as the youth is moving through that continuum of services. Thank you very much.